and welcome to another episode of the Best Book Club. I'm your host, Nufatora, and this is the podcast where I discuss the best stories with the best minds in the community. On this episode, I'll be discussing an all-time classic, Luckily Unlucky by Anticherry with Hans Gutherson. Thank you so much for coming on.
So great to be back. My favorite podcast ever.
Yeah, talking about your favorite story ever.
Yeah, it's up there. Definitely. Top 3.
Yeah. So this story was first posted on September 12th, 2011, and it has almost 320,000 views on Lucky Fetish. As far as I can see,
Mhm.
it's the most viewed thread in the fictional stories board. Where were you at in life when this story came out?
Yeah, 2011. The board was kind of fresh. I was kind of new to it. I was young. I would have been in early high school, I think, which is crazy to think about. Now that's like basically we're 11 years now since that story came out.
Yeah.
Feels like such a long time. A lot's happened since then. I was younger then, still interested in writing and coming up, seeing a lot of those other stories on the board, and it really clicked with me, catching up with that one. And for a lot of reasons, I think we'll get into, but it was such a inspirational story, such an empowering one, and really I think set the tone for the kind of stories I wanted to write, which is typical of Anticherry in general for me.
Definitely. It set the bar, really, for
Yeah.
stories to keep going. And I think it was one of the first stories to really give Lucky Fetish its own identity separate from the original Wedgie Girls website.
Interesting. What makes you say that?
Well, it's it's almost impossible to find any of the original pages from the Wedgie Girls website, but there are some collections on Lucky Fetish that you can read. And so looking at them, where they were at, the quality of them, and then looking at Luckily Unlucky, um, it's entirely different in my mind. There's definitely similarities and parallels that you can draw between them, but um, Luckily Unlucky was so different from every other story that had been released, and the level of quality that it was written in really, in my mind, set the tone for we're not here to fuck around. We're taking this seriously,
Hmm.
um, and I don't want to go in too deep with this thought. I want to save it for future things, but the original board in my mind was because it was the first official place that we gathered. Um, People were just looking to get their desires materialized externally, and so they wrote out stories with no consideration for anything. Whatever came to mind, they put it down. Um, and I think this story is one of the most consistently quality stories available. It set the
Interesting.
tone and I think it gave us an identity all our own as Lucky Fetish, as opposed to a continuation of Wedgie Girls.
Okay. Yeah, I think I see where you're coming from with that. It's interesting to think that when this story comes out, like you said, September 2011, months prior to that, we see on the board a lot of fan fictions of popular brands like Batwoman, Mortal Kombat, and people looking for help on like Smash Bros. Stories, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting then to see a story that's set, it feels like, in a very real world that could happen to any of us. And I think that's something we're going to talk more about. But just how realistic it is, I think, is very interesting. And yeah, I
Absolutely.
think you're right in that when the board started up, Lucky Fish Forums, there was an interest in carrying over a lot of the stuff that had been on Wedgie Girls and making sure a lot of that content was available. And I don't think that Luckily Unlucky was originally posted on the Wedgie Girl site. as many of the stories obviously weren't when they were original to Lucky Fish forums. So yeah, it's interesting to think that it does kind of early on in the board's history. I think yeah, set a tone, show us, and it showed me at least how good stories can be, how detailed they can be, how you can capture the wedgie fetishist experience, which I think ever since the early days of reading that and other inspirational stories for me, it really showed me how possible that was and how important it was.
Definitely. We've referenced this story many times previously and talked about the impact or legacy it's had and influence or inspiration it's been to so many people. What does it mean for something to be those things in this community?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, obviously, but I think one I've tried to address because the question has preoccupied me. In terms of our community specifically, I think the same thing that makes a legacy still applies, and in my mind, that is the sort of influence it has on other writers, and that can be very hard to identify unless you're like constantly staring at the community and looking at everything that comes up. Are you inspiring other writers to write like you in terms of a story? Is there a trend that you're kicking off or characters that are emerging that are very much like what they did? And I think Anticherry hits all of those boxes and more. I think this, what I like to think of as a realist school of writing, emerges out of the work he and others, like Nicely Done and Cosby Rerun, were doing in those early days. That I think is partly a reaction to the fanfics, like I mentioned, and the other, like, very brief, short, kind of really wild stories that are more in that sort of cartoony vein. And it's a bit simplistic to say there's like two camps, the very cartoony and that's set in the real world. And I know obviously you have a more nuanced spectrum yourself and what world does a story exist in. But yeah, I think we can look at the stories that come after Luckily Unlucky and the writers like myself and other influential talents who would look to Anticherry and say he's one of the best and he inspired us. That's always an obvious pointer. And I think the more subtle notes that many of the most popular stories on there are his, but that they also look like an Anticherry story, and it's one you can maybe imagine he would write, like Lucy and Daniela, for all the sort of craziness that happens, and Luckily Unlucky has some of that craziness kind of near the end with some over the top stuff. There's a lot that I feel like is a almost spiritual successor to like a Luckily Unlucky, in that there's a realism to the world and even the characters, and I think we'll get into this, feel like they belong in like an anti-cherry story in some ways, especially like in a YWNR, for example.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that it says exactly. It speaks exactly to the story having influence. Um, it influenced and inspired Lucy and Daniela. Okay. Who is your favorite character?
That's a great question because it also, in my mind, raises the question of who is the story really about.
Hmm.
But before we dive into that too much, I'll just say Becca. She's the best. I love Becca.
Really?
Yeah, I love Becca. So cute. Well, I wish if the story continued, it just became about her and Sarah, which would be problematic because I mean Sarah's like getting into this relationship with Jen, and it's like Auntie Cherry, are you gonna let them be together, or like how many side hustles is Sarah gonna have? Like she's got the goddess, and now she's got Becca, like, and then there's also Bob on the periphery. Like who's she gonna get
Yep.
with? Like it was very unclear in some ways.
Yeah, but it made it fun, and it
Yeah,
also allowed Auntie Cherry to constantly change things up and try new
that's
things.
true. Yeah, that's true.
It's yeah,
Who's your favorite? Do you have a favorite?
it's very tough to say. It might. They're all pretty neck and neck for me. I think it might be the sex goddess. I think it might edge. I think she might have edged
Sure.
it out just because she's so wildly different than
Mm,
any of the other characters. Um, and it was, in some ways, she's very reminiscent of characters from other stories that were being written at the time, and ones from the previous website, but as a much higher level of them, where she actually felt like a real character, and I could not just picture what she looked like, but imagine myself interacting with her.
interesting.
What do you think was going through the mind of Bob while he was getting Sarah down from the beginning, from the hanging wedgie, to actually start to dive into this character, this
It's
story?
funny because Anticherry like points out in the later parts he's his first male main character, just calling him Metal Guy, and he wants him to be this all-knowing presence at first before he realizes like he probably should be more real. I feel like Bob knows. He kind of knows everything from the very beginning. Like she has a fetish, she put herself up there, and the fact he's non-judgmental, I think, is such an interesting like way to start off the story because it's like it feels like a kind of familiar Wattpad esque beginning, experience project esque beginning to the story, where it's like I'm gonna give myself a hanging wedgie. Oh no, I'm stuck.
Hmm.
And then Bob comes in, and it's this very interesting shift where it's like he's not instantly giving her wedgies or something. It's not that kind of story, which you kind of would expect. And I think that's where we first sort of see how Anti-Cherry's a bit different in this story specifically, and what the title means and how that fits into the story. But yeah, I feel like Bob definitely understands and knows exactly what's going on and just is kind of chill with it, which is kind of the dream, right? If you're caught in that kind of position, if you're a wedgie fish, it's just like the first ideal is like they give you more, and then the second is like they just don't really care. And he becomes close friends with Bob, which is very interesting shift.
Definitely, and I, it's an interesting thing that you bring up the similar feel to Experience Project or Wattpad. But I think what sets this beginning apart from those other stories is the range of emotions that Anticherry provides the readers in that one scene. Uh, you go from just being super turned on, wanting to get off, to terrified that somebody will discover her, to mortified that somebody has, and the thoughts that race from that after being discovered in the hanging wedgie, and then surprise, happiness, excitement. It's runs all over the place while having a consistent through line of this makes sense of, yeah, this would happen next and this would. So even just the
Yeah,
beginning
it's a great point.
sets it apart, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the things about Anti-Cherry, and I think in the entire realist school, of which Anti-Cherry is probably the dean. Um, and I ascribe to this realism. I think one of the key elements of it is a attention to psychological realism and psychological detail and what a character is thinking and feeling. And you don't often see that in a lot of the more cartoony stories. The thing with Anti-Cherry is the characters can be a bit one note, but they have these very rich internal worlds, which I think is very fascinating. And I think something I took into my own stories as well, where it's like you have a character like Sarah, she's a fetishist, but there's not much going on with her beyond that. We don't see her like working or having like some other big stuff going on in her life other than a bit of like the school stuff, but that really does take a back seat. But very, very deep imagination, The way she sees people is very creative, almost like a writer. And the sex goddess isn't just a person she sees, but she sort of builds an identity for them that she hypes up in her mind in some ways, it feels like. So yeah, definitely this great mix of emotions and feel. I think definitely a master at that, Anticherry is.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's an interesting balance um, that he struck between having Sarah almost exclusively focused on um, sexual things and the wedgie fetish, but writing it in a way that you can glean so much about her character outside of it from that. To, I guess to sort of retool something I said is that I mean the beginning, at least in my mind, feels so different from any other story I remember from the time because he not only starts it with a hanging wedgie, which a lot of stories did, but he also had somebody actually discover Sarah in it, and we did discuss
Mm-hmm.
that to some degree. One small little thing that I really enjoy about this story is the little titles that Andy Cherry gives to each section.
Yes. Yeah.
It gives the readers just a little bit more insight into uh, his mind, his intentions behind each section. Throughout the story, there was, especially in the beginning, um, there are the wedgies that are given are they happen pretty fast, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that gives it a very realistic feel because that's how they would happen in real life,
Yeah.
like the one that Jen gives Sarah while they're shopping. It wouldn't be
Mm-hmm.
this huge prolonged affair. Um, it would just be a pull, and it would be done.
Yeah, it feels like definitely there's a mix there. There's ones that are quick and very realistic, and then there's ones that are incredibly hot, but super detailed, which I think is another great mark of what is a realistic story and what in my mind is a really good story, and it separates it from like other ones where it's like she pulled and it hurt. You really get all those emotions, all those little elements, and even just how he describes some characters and what they're wearing. He made me fall in love with beanies because Sarah's wearing it, and the beanie is like this interesting thing, and where the beanie is, and what characters are doing with like their clothes, and it's I think it's a really cool stuff that all builds the world and is a good I think like tutorial almost in how to do that.
Yeah, definitely. It actually brought up an interesting thought from my mind. Is the It seems to be the case that the things that we call realistic are the ones that give the the most amount of details about what people are feeling, the surroundings. It gives the most detail. It helps us picture what's going on very clearly, and so it makes it feel realistic because we can actually visualize what's going on, as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
those stories that just say they gave a really painful pull and it hurt. I can't really picture that, so it doesn't feel realistic.
Yeah, and I mean it's so common on even on Lucky Fish, those early stories, and even ones we see come up from time to time, but definitely like a plague on places like Experience Project, Wattpad, and just wherever you'd see stories where it's like she put on four pairs of underwear and she pulled one over her head, pulled another one, the other one went around, and it's like, what do they look like? And the fact that it is so rushed, and it's just they think, as a lot of new writers do, in my experience, seeing a lot of this, there's this assumption that like the more wedgies that happen, the more crazy it is, the better it is. But I
Yeah.
mean, if we can't get into the scene, it's gonna mean nothing. And we're gonna see a bunch of numbers. We're gonna see 12 pairs, and we're gonna see 8 hours of wedgies, like is what you're gonna tell us, but not a single thing of it's gonna matter. Whereas in like a Luckily Unlucky, something like that flagpole scene, which is one of the best in stories, is very drawn out, very intense. You really feel every moment of it, and you do feel like you're there watching it. And that's definitely a testament to the sort of power Anticherry could have in writing. And although he has a great penchant for exclamation marks, which could be a bit of throwing me off personally, but I think he's one of the best at really making you feel like you're in a scene.
Definitely. Um, yeah, I think it comes down to the difference between um, just getting off or actually appreciating the story and investing in it,
Hmm.
actually caring about it. It seems like.
Yeah, because there is a story there which is interesting when you think of like some others where you wonder like did the writer just want to capture like random different scenes that they had in their head, like even the early like Wedgie Academy story, you're like where could this actually go, and things like that where you're like what was actually the story here. Early bully stories like Sarah the Bully, it's like what was the plan, like I
Mhm.
could see these very hot sequence of events, but what's the overarching tale. Luckily Unlucky, I think, is in a weird middle ground because it feels like the story really is about Jen discovering the fetish, and that's what I hinted at. Like, who's the story really about? Sarah's one thing throughout, kind of like Ferris Bueller's Day Off. She's the Ferris, where she starts out the same way as she ends. She's got this fetish, and
Mhm.
she meets new people, and she gets to feel different things. But I mean, it's really Sarah's story, discovering this fetish, coming into it, realize struggling with it, like the thing we all go through. Sarah doesn't have that. She skips over it. So it's kind of like, where's the arc? What is the? She's very static in that way. So
Definitely.
it's interesting to think about from that angle, and just overall, like where was the story going? Like if you'd continued it, would they get together in the end, Jen and Sarah? Is that the story? Is it just a bunch of more scenes where like the sex goddess has hot moments and Becca comes in too, and is it a giant wedgie orgasm with all the characters together at the end? Like I wasn't. It's unclear in some ways. Whereas some stories, like if they continued it, generally where it might go, and you can see like, oh, okay, it'd be Karate Friends. There's probably a big karate fight at the end, and they take down the bad bullies and stuff. But luckily, unlucky, it's kind of hard to speculate where it was gonna go, what the plan was there.
Definitely. Yeah, I think Sarah was the protagonist in the beginning because the story revolved around her, and then it changed into Jen's story. So I definitely agree with you there.
Yeah, and when I mentioned Ferris Bueller, I should have finished the thought. Like in that case, Cameron, it's his story because he's the one who changes and stuff.
Yeah,
Just for people who were like, "What does he mean? He's Ferris. Who's Cameron?" It's Cameron's story because he's the one who changes and is affected by the events of the day. So I feel like that's the same thing with Jen and Sarah. It's the one who actually changes, who grows from things, who gets to experience the fetish like we do, has that arc. I think that makes it a story about her, but it's kind of interesting that we can even ask that question. I think that gives it a depth that probably sets it apart from some other stories out there from the time. And just in general, because it's usually pretty clear that like the wedgie fetishist is the main character, like in a Sadistic by Cosby Rerun. It's like the gorgeous pseudo sadist. She's clearly the main character. There's no question of like who is the main character here. Um, and the examples go on. So it's very interesting. You can look and say, oh, maybe it's actually about Sarah and her, and I mean about Jen and her evolution.
yeah, gives that a little bit of room for speculation from the reader to draw them in
Mm-hmm.
that much more. And it seems like Anticherry hit the perfect balance between porn and actual story. I mean, I can't help but get turned on by reading it. There's no getting around that. Um, but it was the draw of the wedgies that brought people in, and the story kept people coming back.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's the fact that we know from data the most important thing for readers of wedgie stories is the characters, and I think he really captures that as well as he sort of does in his anti-cherry way. Like I said, there's still pretty one note, as his characters usually are. They have like one, maybe two things that they focus on or kind of are that make up their identity. Wedgies is almost always one of those things.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think of like Reggie Wedgie, the other thing for his female protagonist, co-protagonist Reggie, is that she's a camp counselor at this camp. That's her other thing. The other is she's like a wedgie fetishist. And then the male protagonist there, kind of like Bob, is just kind of there. He's so like not a thing that he's supposed to be an us stand-in, a reader stand-in, who doesn't talk, who just sort of gets the wedgies and stuff. Kind of like a dream scenario if you're into getting. But similar with like Sore Winner, which I'm sure we can talk a whole podcast about too. It's like they play a little sports and there's wedgies. It's kind of like there's not a deeper like character there, but I think in some ways that works because you still get those really like rich emotional lives that I'm talking about that I think is typical of his work. So
Yeah.
like he finds this interesting way to make characters where you still care about them, but they're not like, oh, and I know all their backstory and I know all about their family's history and all this other stuff. It's like he cuts through a lot of that, but you still end up, because of like the things they do and how they think about the wedgies, you're like, I'm into these characters. I want to see what happens to them.
Yeah. And the reason that happens is because of indirect detail. There's so much that you imply from the interactions that the characters have together that you learn so much about them without them actually saying it out loud, as you would if you were observing the dynamic of people in real life. They're not going to be talking about, oh yeah, my this is my mom and we love each other, or we're not okay, or my cousin, we see each other once in a while, so things like that. It's the way that they interact. That's what reveals that background detail. I think Sore Winner isn't quite as good of an example as you think it is, because the wedgies in that story. I don't want to tread on that ground too much because we will do an episode about it. But they're only there as a competition of sorts. Neither of the two main combatants really are into them. They just it's a competition between them to see who will win. So it is it kind of changes
Yeah.
things up quite a
No,
bit.
I was saying like the aspects of their character. Like in that case, you're
Yeah,
right. They don't even have a fetish, so they just are sporty, like students. Like
right,
that's their one thing.
right.
We don't get like more details about them beyond that like one anchor, I guess, in their
Yeah.
character.
Oh,
So
yeah.
yeah, luckily and lucky, we have like their students too. But we also, in the case of like Jen and Sarah, have like that they're wedgie fetishists
Yeah.
eventually. So it's like these little points that as a reader you can latch onto and say, okay, I can understand like this character a little bit. They're not as one note as like Between Two Cheeks character, for example. He's an easy example to pull out. His stories are incredibly popular because he captures very well the incredibly popular dynamic of like the one note characters. He was
Yeah.
so popular, I was like inspired with my own Wedgie Treetopper story to try and do what he did, and I made very similar characters. I mean, it's our gothic, kind of not into the holidays character, and a more cheery, nerdy one who loves the holidays. And that story was very popular because it's that formula that people really like,
Yes.
where they are very one note. They're one thing. They're like, I'm the goth and I'm the nerd
Yeah.
and stuff like that. So Anticherry, similar, but I think goes slightly deeper in his characters in a way that's nuanced and significant enough to set them apart. And I
Yes.
think that's what brings a lot of people back because
Yeah.
character is so key.
Yeah. That's a very good point. Something that seems to be glossed over whenever people talk about this story is Sarah's little sister. There are two times where she's
Yeah,
involved in things that are sexual to us. And there's
sure.
also a section where Anticherry brings the reader back to when Sarah was 16. Um,
Yeah.
the obvious answer to this is no, but I'm curious how you feel this. Are there times when a minor can be included in a work, but the story is still okay?
Yeah, it's so tricky. And I mean, I've talked about this at length where it's like if it has nothing to do with the wedgies. The short answer is I don't really know. I don't really have an answer to this question. 'Cause I mean, if they're not at all involved, I'd probably lean on no, as you know. Because I
Hmm.
mean, even with something like Between Two Cheeks' stories, he got a lot of hate, and I also called him out in some instances where there were just underage characters who would come in and just be present, and I wouldn't like that. So even here in something like A Luckily Unlucky, we have to acknowledge that and
Yep.
say it's not good that
Yeah.
there's underage characters in any instance. But then, yeah, I mean, it becomes very complicated. You say, what if you're just briefly talking about when a character was younger or something, or you're trying to capture totally separate from the wedgies some like mention of their past and things that
Yep.
happened to them. Can you do that at all, or do you have to say no, their life begins when they're 18 and nothing
Right.
happened to them before that?
Yeah.
So I mean, I think it's a tricky question, and I don't know the answer to it, but yeah, I think in no matter what the story is, we can still analyze it, but we have to call out like any underage content, note that it's not okay, and try and pull out why that is not okay and
Right.
why I think the story maybe still has some significance despite it, if that makes sense.
Definitely. Are there any sections you wish had been expanded? I personally wish the wedgie from Sarah's mom had been expanded. Are there any that you
Yeah, I
did?
wish he had ended the story and kept writing it. I wish the whole thing was longer and expanded. Yeah, I mean, I wish we got more with Becca. Like, just in general, scenes around her were really cool. She was just fun, very bubbly presence. And you're kind of like, what's her deal? I want to know more about her. Same as Bob. Every scene with Bob, it's like you could just do a story about her getting over, and by her I mean Sarah getting over her anxiety and becoming friends with Bob and opening up about the fetish with someone. I think like even that could be its own interesting story. There's a lot of interesting moments. There's some that's like it's really well done. Like he doesn't do it overboard with some of the wedgies, which I like. Where you're like, hey, I've already like gotten off to this. You can stop now. Um, but yeah, those are some examples. I think some of those relationship moments, I really would have liked to see more.
Definitely. And it's interesting to think about how Becca is sort of the Becca and the sex goddess sort of are the same character but two different degrees. Where
Mm,
the sex goddess is the intense, passionate, um, lustful version of the character, whereas Becca is the playful and sort of
yeah,
happy-go-lucky version of it.
sure.
So you brought it up before, and now is where I really want to discuss it: the flagpole scene. It's the second hanging wedgie in this story, and I think it's the best hanging wedgie scene of any story because there's so much depth to
Hmm.
it. You have Sarah forcing herself to pretend that she isn't loving every second of it, which shows the reader that Sarah still holds some secrets from even her best friend, and makes me wonder what else she holds back from others. You have Jen diving back into her bullying self, which shows the domination, sadistic aspect of her personality, and perhaps some foreshadowing to later when she discovers she sexually enjoys being bullied. The wedgie itself being an allegory to the tension between the two rising, just like Sarah has, and the switch in roles very soon after. Those are some things that I picked up on.
I like that. That's some cool observations. Definitely, it seems like you've been thinking about it a lot, which is excellent. I think the interesting thing about the story to note is I think Luckily Unlucky is a story about stories. It's about storytelling. It's no coincidence in my mind that Jen lives on Teller Street. It's about Sarah telling
Okay.
Jen about the fetish and things like that. Like that's what the story's about at its core. It's opening up And it's about fantasy. It's about what we create as fetishes for ourselves, the way we look at people and we dream about what could happen and the situations we create. So when we think about the sex goddess and Becca, it's like we look at that and we're thinking about what's going to happen and we're picturing different scenes and the things we want to see and exactly what your question was, what do we want to see expanded? I think Anticherry invites that in
Yeah.
his story and is subtly pointing out like you can create your own stories, and I think that's partly why I was encouraged to do so after reading some of his work, because it felt like there's storytelling in everything that happens. There's creating things and moments and narratives for ourselves. There's a lot of moments in Luckily Unlucky where people are fantasizing and having dreams about different things that could happen. And you're thinking, like, yeah, like any of these could be a really cool story moment or just really cool scenes that are really encouraging from a writer perspective. You think, yeah, I could write something like this. And I feel like definitely the flagpole scene was inspirational for me writing Lucy and Daniela and many of the other like moments in the story. Just empowering in that way where it's like, what about this cool moment, or like this idea of the fence and just the different fantasies that they create. Like, how do I capture that imagination of what it means to be a fetishist? I think.
Yeah. That's a great observation of it. I think you're very correct. And it would be it would be interesting to sort of look at different major stories and look at the parallels between them. Um, do you think Sarah and Jen are good friends to each other? Actually, you have Jen. She goes over the line, in my opinion, after the flagpole, and it's only seen as okay because Sarah's into it. And in the same
Yeah.
vein, Sarah blackmails Jen into getting more wedgies and inadvertently fulfilling a sexual
Yeah.
fantasy of Sarah's. Um,
It's pretty wild,
are they
yeah.
good
You
friends?
got It's a
Actually,
great question. It's a great question, yeah. I feel like the fetish makes you do strange manipulative things at times, potentially, depending who you are and how horny you are. I think there's a good question there. They're probably not in some ways when you think about it until they are again, if that makes sense. It's like there really is those rocky moments in their friendship where it's like they go way too far with things that I don't think any like real friends, fetishists or no, would ever get into. So part of that like fantastical element that seeps into the story, like it really, the whole realism slips away in moments like the when Jen returns to high school and gets bullied by like a gang of students. It's like, is does that really fit in with like the more realistic fact that, like, for example, Sarah doesn't even give Becca a wedgie when she has an opportunity to?
hmm
Like, that feels very real. That's something that could happen. Does that jive with what we see when uh, Jen gets ganged up on and bullied? It's like it's almost like two different stories, like that are here. One more fantastical and over the top, where friends can blackmail each other and give insane, extreme, crazy wedgies, and then one where it's like I hung myself up, couldn't get down, and had a lot of anxiety trying to come to terms with like realizing this person probably knows. It's very different stories, interestingly.
yeah, definitely. There's definitely there's definitely a can of worms there that you'd have to dissect in order to figure out how if their friendship is good or not. They cross the line. I think it is only okay because it turns out they're into it. Um, but it's also a story, so it can things can happen. And there's definitely um, events that happen before that. I guess in a way allow those moments to be in the story at all, and not feel out of place because other things that probably wouldn't actually happen do, like the hanging wedgie in the beginning. The, it it sort of feels like an expanding of the realism as opposed to it's jarring and this is just thrown in here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yeah.
and I think it just as a little thing, it is. I think it's actually really nice that Anticherry put those things in there to show the different side of the characters instead of just they're they're good together. They really they're the best of friends and they have a lot of fun. It shows it gives a lot of great characterization. I think in that way.
Yeah.
Something that I always forget about until I get to it is the messy wedgie. For one of the wedgies,
Yeah.
Sarah gives to Jen to delete a picture. I always, for some reason, I never remember it until I get to it. Sarah's sexual thoughts about Jen constantly bring to mind feeling the fire until it burns by Nicely Done. I don't know if you had a similar thing happen to you where you were thinking of why it sort of reminded you of other stories. Um, but it sort of ties into a thought I have later on. But it's an interesting thing, at least I think.
That it reminds you of other stories at times. There's scenes
Yeah,
you're
that
saying that like
you can sort
resonate.
of
Okay.
see you without realizing it. You sort of when when you think of other stories while reading it, you can see oh yeah, so you can see the influence that it's had potentially.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was a college wedgie story. I think was the title by I think, Powerful Blossom. That you can read the beginning, and it's clear it's a take on what happens in the beginning of Luckily Unlucky.
Hmm.
Although the genders are reversed, and there it's a guy who gives himself a wedgie. He's caught by a woman, and this woman wants to then make him her wedgie slave and give him more wedgies and stuff. So like you can definitely see, and that's a relatively recent story in the last couple of years. That's definitely like a Luckily Unlucky take. And I feel subtly like I've made it no secret. He's been a great inspiration to me in many of the stories I've written, and others have said the same thing. Anime panties, for example, and I think many of those who may post on Lucky Fish forums before sharing their work other way in other places were inspired by that realism and wanted to capture that mind of a fetishist. I think a lot of that spans from Anticherry, but also what others like Cosby Rerun and Nicely Done were doing at around the same time. I think it's like this collective reaction potentially to the old Wedgie Girls site, and even more obvious is the, like I mentioned, those fanfics and very short, brief stories that don't have a lot of detail that would get posted at the beginning of the board's history. So you have writers, I think, naturally say, I'm going to do something different or I'm going to do something better than that. I know that's at least my reaction when I see a lot of that, but I imagine there's something human in saying, yeah, like if this story, which is one giant paragraph with not a lot of detail but a lot of sexual stuff, and it got more than 4,000 views. I can do something like that, and I can get more views, and I can write something like I want to read based on everything I like the
Hmm.
anti-cherries, and carry on that legacy.
Yeah. Something I absolutely love is how Anti Cherry focuses in on the domination and submission aspects of the fetish from time to time, actually doing justice to a major aspect of the fetish for many of us,
Mm-hmm.
where other stories, I think, either don't talk about it at all or sort of fumble it in some ways. So, talking about the characters again, um, the characters are so well written that even a character that has almost no screen time, I start to really like. Sarah's cousin Sam is only around for the New Year's Eve party for two scenes,
Mm-hmm.
yet she's written so well that she feels very real and authentic to the world, like she was already a part of it, not just a character that was made for that scene.
Yeah, I like his dialogue. He writes good dialogue, and you can feel like he does capture that, like, embarrassing, humiliating kind of dialogue at times, and like what is teasing and what is really just fun to hear. So things like his Halloween story he posted in the short story
Mhm.
thread, it's just really fun, like very quickly in the description of what the character is wearing and in the dialogue she says very quickly depicts her as a very hot bully to the main
Mhm.
character in that story. So he's definitely able to do it very quickly, and as I mentioned, he's really in some ways like the tutorial, the book to follow for how to write good wedgie stories.
Yeah, absolutely. After rereading, it became so obvious to me how influenced I was by Sarah when initially writing Riley in my story, my recently finished story, Fortunate Events. And I think that's why the opening line grabbed you so much, because it's a distillation of Sarah down to a very basic but ever present and overarching detail about an essentially universally loved character.
Yeah, I think I see where you're going. Definitely, it's the fact that he's so able, Anticherry, to capture what it means to be a wedgie fetishist. I think has always gravitated towards me, and since then I've been preoccupied with stories that do that, that try to pull the mirror up to who we are and explore it in some ways. And with Anticherry's characters and Luckily Unlucky, you really do feel like it's a love letter to the fetish and who we are as a people. And it's like Sarah has her struggles, but she has such a great imagination, and she really is so lucky. We can only all wish to be that lucky, really.
Yeah.
So it's something to look at, and you go like, this is the dream in a lot of ways. All the craziness aside, it's like she is able to have her best friend, who she's got these sexual feelings towards, get close to her and share this fetish with her. And you read that, you're like, this is amazing. I wish I was in this story.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Um, that's just a little thing I thought might ring true. Something else that I absolutely love is Jen's complete lack of inhibition when she gets herself off during her hanging wedgie. Anticherry made it entirely believable with all the prior details about Jen being very open and playful with Sarah that when the time came to it, she she was able to let herself go and not worry about much of anything. She just focused on getting herself off. Just a little bit more of, I guess, a sort of a culmination of characterization.
Okay.
Oh, beyond the obvious, because that's what Anticherry wanted to do, why do you think Sarah is almost constantly thinking sexually? Is it something to do with the fetish that we always see it as super weird and taboo when it isn't really?
Maybe. I think because when he wrote it, he started writing that when he was 18, so he was probably, as many of us are, in that same mindset where we're thinking a lot about them. And at that point, we're also not just thinking about wedgies, but what does this mean? Like, we by that age generally have an understanding of, like, we have this fetish and we probably will have it for life. So what is that going to mean for our relationships, for our future, for our friendships? Is it going to get in the way? What is our future going to look like now that we understand fully we are this thing, which is not entirely very common? And so it's interesting to me to think like Sarah understands she's like part of a community, because it's in this story, right, where she goes to undiesup.com,
Mm-hmm.
I believe. um so like she's part of a community in some ways, so I think it's part of Anti-Cherry exploring all of those questions around identity, how that's tied to the fetish, how we can feel like it dominates our identity when maybe it is probably just a very small part of it. But at her age, the age of the characters, it's a pretty key aspect that they're just in some cases getting to explore for the very first time. When we first meet Sarah, she's obviously like lived entirely in this land of fantasy and self-fulfillment, and being given the opportunity to explore that, I think it really works in making sure the whole story revolves around that. And at the same time, for me, when we as writers are thinking about the actual crafting of a story, the big question that very often comes up is how many wedgies do we put in? How often do we do it? And when you do like the anti-cherry approach, where they're weaved into the narrative almost constantly,
Yep.
you don't always have to have wedgie scenes. As long as you have a character thinking about them, I think that really can meet the expectations of readers, but also be a very interesting storytelling technique. You get
Mhm.
to explore all those thoughts you have generally and really keep hitting home this idea like this is a story about the identity of a fetishist, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And something to go along with that is, I think Anticherry's portrayal of Jen's wedgie exploration is done really well because it shows the initial exploration of wedgie fetishists when they discover they have this fetish. So I think it adds more to what you were saying, is that it is describing how it feels and how it is to be a wedgie fetishist.
Mm-hmm.
You did mention this before, but I'm curious if you have an idea for it. So, what do you think is the best or right way to end this story? Like how?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Since I'm such a romantic, I would have Jen and Sarah get together and have a big family, and their kids would also have a wedgie fetish, and they're gonna have to like explain what that is to their kids and stuff.
Oh my god.
And they're gonna tell them the stories of how they met, and that's what Luckily Unlucky is gonna be. It turns out, like them explaining the story of how they met to their kids and all the stuff they went through. Just you would think kind of inappropriate story to tell kids, but maybe their daughter's like 18 and like I don't understand who I am, and then they're telling
Yep.
her this story to like make her understand it's okay or something.
Yeah.
That's one way to do it.
Yeah. They felt.
Another is like, yeah, Sarah and Becca hang out and they're just like chilling on like a hill looking at the sunset.
Yeah.
You just end it there.
For the kids thing is, it could be that the reason that they're explaining it to their kids is that they Sarah and Jen found them just like how Bob found Sarah in the beginning of the story. They found them in a hanging wedgie.
Oh, that would be good. Yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds good. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
honestly
That's
not
kind of
sure.
full circle.
I'm not sure how I would write it. I would at least get to the part where Sarah actually uh, meets up with the sex goddess, because that is I wish that had been put in there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't know. Um, yeah, I don't know if I really have an answer to that. It's very tough to say because it is such a different style from my own writing. Um, what do you feel is the greatest strength of this story?
I think the depth to it that we hit on, this idea that like it's not just a wedgie story, but that it feels to me, whether intentional or not, that it's about storytelling and
Hmm.
fantasy and real life stories and how stories develop over time. I think that's probably its greatest strength. You can look at it and just read it as a really fun wedgie story, which is mostly just like a sequence of different wedgies with a bit of like driving plot where there's the blackmail and they get closer, but other characters are in the periphery, so you feel like it's growing and growing as a story. And there's a lot, like you mentioned, to keep you engaged and wonder what's going to happen next. But at the same time, you can look at it and you can wonder like how much of an exploration is it into identity? How much is it about the fantasies we create as a community? And I think that's probably its best part, and one of the reasons it really resonates with me.
Okay, I that's those are definitely very high points of the story in my opinion as well. But I think the greatest strength of it is how Anticherry perfectly blends actual story and characterization with literary porn. Looking at the time period that it came out, um, later on, you do have the sort of the growing catalog of stories that do what it luckily unlucky did to varying degrees. But at the time, there really wasn't any other story that was doing that. And so the fact that he was able to capture it, be one of the first to do so, I think that is what sets it apart above all else. So on the flip side of that, what do you feel is the greatest weakness of
It's not finished. I want to
it?
know how it ends.
Yeah.
Why you do this to us, Anticherry?
Yeah, that's probably the greatest weakness, but I wasn't entirely sure. But after you said this, I think it is the lack of extra personality traits for characters. What's there is so w- well realized that we're able to extrapolate and interpret so much more about the characters. But when you step back for a minute, away from reveling in, wow, yeah, this is such an amazing story, one of the best, and you look at it objectively, the characters really don't have much going on, and so having lacking those extra personality traits beyond wedgie fetishist and student things like that, um,
Yeah.
I think it brings it down just a touch. Going back to the legacy of the story, why has this story continuously been revered as one of the best?
Yeah, I think you hit on it. I think it is how engaging the characters are. And like I pointed out already, we know that's the most important element for most readers. It has to be the characters, character, character, character. And that's not just for wedgie stories. We know consensus wise, characters is what's going to draw us. Your story can be meh, but if you don't have a cool character who's experiencing interesting stuff or who's dealing with stuff and you can't relate to them or engage with them, it's not going to go anywhere. So I think probably the fact like Sarah does have such a rich inner life, even if as like a collection of like different one word descriptors, fetishist, student, like there's not a lot there. We don't get a lot of backstory or see her do much beyond give and get wedgies,
Mhm.
uh, which is an interesting idea and perhaps where this idea of the sort of wedgie girl really originates from in the community.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the fact that there's such a rich inner psychological life to the characters, that the dialogue feels good and real, and that the things they do, because of how they're described, both in terms of clothing and actions and reactions to things, you can come back to this story anytime, even in 100 years, and say like, yeah, this is how you write wedgie scenes because you really capture what it feels like and what is exciting for us to read, which is some of that humiliation, embarrassment, and all the mix of feelings you get in a very elevated way. And then also just this idea that it's really fun, I think, too, as a story. There's a lot of really wild scenes that happen, a lot of over the top moments, but you can come back to it any time and say, like, I still remember those scenes that stand out. That
Hmm.
flagpole scene,
Yep.
and just some of those moments where, yeah, the blackmail and how just like crazy and over the top some of that gets, and it sticks with you because
Yeah.
it's different from some other stories where you don't get that same level of detail. Certainly.
Absolutely. Yeah. Those are the ones I think that last the longest, that stick with us the longest. But
Yeah.
on the flip side, I think I have three reasons why, including the ones that you laid out. But one reason I see is that Anticherry delivers back to back to back to back top notch wedgie scenes, perfectly laying out what's happening to fully visualize. And two examples of this are the flagpole scene and the final blackmail wedgie, wherein both it starts one way and then completely naturally upends your expectation on what will happen. The second reason is related to the first, that there is almost no downtime. There's no boredom or you feel that the story is dragging on. It's like he brought people onto a roller coaster with one ascent, and even that was exciting. And he won't let anyone off, though the ride is so enjoyable. Nobody wants to get off. They all want to get off, but they don't want to get off the ride. um,
Clever.
and he also delivers amazingly written scenes for all kinds of wedgies, keeping the appeal of the story extremely broad and accessible. There's a little something for everyone. I think both sides of I think what you said and I said are equally important reasons as to why it has lived on. Because the story did come out at a time where it was it sort of still felt like a requirement to write lots of wedgies and have them like not really have a lack of wedgies, I guess. And being able to deliver those so well, I think it also sticks. How has this story
Thanks.
influenced and inspired you?
Yeah, I hit on a lot of that
Yeah.
already. To just speed run through it. I feel like a lot of the realism I try to capture in my stories comes directly from the works of Anticherry and others like him, which I'm quick to mention, like Nicely Done, Cosby Rerun, being two very obvious examples of those early LF days.
Hmm.
I think when I see some of the stuff Anti-Cherry did with characters, even subtly, like when you look at like a Lucy and Danielle, they're the same character model in that they're also like kind of one note. Lucy is the nerd who gets wedgies. She doesn't have like a job. She has her love of Spider-Man. So that's one other sort of trait. She's kind of like a comic nerd, but there's not like a lot of other stuff going on. We don't get like she has this family stuff. She's got this other set. And it's sort of with the Tracy trilogy, same thing. You get teachers who are wedgie fetishists. You get students who are wedgie fetishists. And it's like there's a lot of moments there where it's like you can feel like the same character approach to writing characters is taken from like what an anti-cherry has done in something like a Luckily Unlucky. And I think the biggest one is that interest in psychological realism I have. I'm not content to be like someone got a wedgie. I have to tell you exactly what they're thinking and feeling and digress probably more than a lot of people would like into aspects of like what it means to be a fetishist and try to answer that question in my own writing. And I think that question was planted in my mind from the early days of like Luckily Unlucky and some of those other stories that he did.
Yeah. Okay.
But
Um.
especially that one because it really does explore like what it means to be a fetishist more than his other stories do. I think more than any of his other stories. Like Alternative Punishment, for example, there's none of that.
Yeah.
It's a hot sequence of wedgies.
Hmm.
I know you've spoken about that
Right.
one. Sore Winner, same thing. Like you
Yep.
mentioned, it's a competition. Like the
Yeah.
wedgies are just ever present.
Yep.
Competition, wedgies versus everybody. And
Hmm.
short stories like Rachel Halloween, which I mentioned, is same thing. It's not at all interested in like what does it mean to like wedgies or any of that. It's like the bully sister is gonna give it to her not as tough sister who's gonna
Yep.
stand up and fight back and stuff. So yeah, it's interesting that that is his sort of contribution to the wedgie fetish identity canon, I guess, of stories, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. The three that you brought up, besides Luckily Unlucky, none of them are about fetishists. They're it's
Mm-hmm.
just wedgies are brought up because of some one thing or another. Um, Luckily Unlucky is because it features focuses on fetishists, um, Anticherry is able to write to his level of quality about what it means to be a fetishist. For me, it was one of the stories that showed me how high quality we could go with writing wedgie stories. It was one of the first that I'd seen that revealed to me, yeah, we could actually write legitimate stories rather than just stuff to get
Mm-hmm.
off on. And I realized from this story that I like much less wedgies than were present at the time. Instead, having the build up and storytelling between and having the wedgies as a side note instead of the main focus. Um, and it's been a major influence on how I write my stories. Like as I said before, Fortunate Events is, I think at first was very, very inspired by Luckily Unlucky until I found the identity of the story and let it be its own thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's been a little bit, but now that we're actually discussing a story, I'd like to bring it real quick to the Witch Earth segment. And for anybody who's not aware or who needs a refresher, I split stories into four different Earths. The first one being realistic Earth, where Earth is normal as we live it every day. Alternate Earth, where Earth has changed to some degree, with wedgies being a center focus. Idealistic Earth, where Earth has changed to fit the desires of the wedgie community or some aspect of it, depending on the writer. And fantastical Earth, where Earth has changed to be unrecognizable. Which one of those do you think Luckily Unlucky falls under?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I probably would have had a slightly different answer before we started talking, but after some of your interesting points, I might have to go idealistic, just thinking about the friendship that the characters have, friendship in quotation marks, after your very good observations. It's this idea that, yeah, after everything crazy that happens between them and the very intensity of those moments, the blackmail, some of that manipulation, it's like, would two actual girls decide to be friends with each other after that? Like, we don't, I guess, unfortunately, have a lot of like prior moments to see them like cementing a friendship.
Hmm.
We understand from a throwaway reference that they were friends since like second grade, I think it
Yep.
was. But we don't have like any cool scenes where we want obviously want them underage, but even before the wedgies start popping off, like there's no real moments where they're really just hanging out free from wedgies. So that makes
Yeah.
it a bit tricky to think like, oh, they're really dear friends and we see that, and so they can weather a few like kind of crazy and intense moments that you would think potentially break up some friendships in real life. But that whole aspect that you pointed out, mixed with the fact that there are very over the top moments, this whole presence of a sex goddess and how she carries herself and is able to like basically start doing things to Sarah in public and all this other stuff. I feel like there is an idealistic element to it, and I think your definitions are especially helpful here because it's how we explain where it fits when it bridges this gap between realistic, hyper realistic in some ways is how I would describe it, and the stories I'm into and were inspired by. And then yeah, this fantastical, really wild, over the top sort of stuff that does not feel like it would happen in real life.
Yeah. Yeah, it's you would automatically think like realistic Earth, absolutely, because it's written so realistically. But yeah, these
Mhm.
kinds of things, as far as we're aware, don't normally happen. I think
Exactly,
just the
yeah.
existence of the sex goddess, that's just sort of her.
Yeah.
That's Sarah's name for the character, and we never find out her actual name. But I don't think that necessarily detracts away from the realism of it actually happening in real life. I think she's just a fetish worker, a prostitute of sorts, a call girl. Um, but yeah, definitely some of the public things that she does, like pantsing her on the train on the
Yeah,
bus,
and
and
for free too. Like that
yeah,
would cost you. You'd think she could charge her big bucks for all that like free
yeah.
service stuff she's giving her.
Well, I mean, as
Crazy.
Bob tells her when she tries to find out about who the sex goddess is, she owns the
Yeah.
place. So, and she takes a liking to Sarah. So I'm sure
Yeah.
that could happen. But yeah, I think you're
How
pretty on the
lucky.
I think you're pretty on the point with idealistic Earth.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, do you have any other thoughts or things you wanted to discuss that we haven't hit on?
No, don't think so. I think you asked good questions, and we were able to really cover it and talk about Anticherry, who deserves all the love in the world. Um, yeah, it's a very popular story. For those interested in Anticherry a bit more, I did a Q&A with him a few years back on DA. You can find that on my profile. And he talks about Luckily Unlucky there and other stories and what it is, what it means to be as popular as he became on Lucky Fish forums, especially. And Anticherry, if you're out there listening, please write more of the story. Please. And please write more in general. We love you.
Yeah. Do you have anything you'd like to plug?
No, I'm working on some secret stuff, as people know. So keep an eye out. Slowly grinding away on a bunch of stuff.
Yeah. All right. And so ends another amazing discussion with the encyclopedia and pillar of the community, Hans Gutherson. Thank you so much for coming on.
So great to be here. And everyone, listen to this podcast. That's my plug. Listen to more and read everything Nofutora does, please.
Yeah, I have some things in the work as well.
Woohoo!
All right. If there are any topics, stories, ideas, etc., that you'd like to hear me discuss, or if you'd like to come on for an episode, leave a comment or send me a message on DeviantArt as New Fatora and Lucky Fetish as the same. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.